Greetings and good day to you, whatever your time zone might be. Today I'd like to talk about a concept I term responsible reproduction. Of course, responsible reproduction is not a catchphrase and it's not a term that is used in common parlance, at least much. I've never heard it in normal discourse. But it is a term I use to describe the notion that when people decide to have children, even prior to conception, there's a set of responsibilities that they ought to take into account, and that this set of responsibilities is often ignored and not taken into account. To give a good example of what I'm talking about, before expanding further on the topic, give a little of an anecdote of my own life or my own observation. So sometimes there's a kiosk I walk by in my neighborhood, and I generally like to grab a morning coffee, mostly for the purposes of defecation more than for any high it gives me. It seems to facilitate that quite well. And I'll walk by this kiosk and I'll pick up a coffee, and the workers there, they're on rotation. I imagine they're part-time. And there's a woman there, a young woman, she looks to be in her young 20s, who's obviously pregnant. I think at this time she must be at least 6 months in, maybe 5, maybe 7, hard to say. But she's always there with a pack of cigarettes. And sometimes when I walk into this store or this kiosk, she's in the back smoking a cigarette. And she is heavy with child. This would be an example, to my mind, of irresponsible reproduction. Because we know that smoking is not only deleterious and harmful to the individual engaging in the smoking itself, but a woman who's carrying a child in the smoking is also almost certainly going to damage the child. Smoking when you're pregnant can lead to birth defects, it can lead to premature birth, etc., etc. You don't know the horrors that could potentially be visited upon a child who is the product of smoking. Is it possible to get away without any issues and that your offspring might be okay? Yeah, sure, but it's a very, very risky endeavor indeed. And of course, there is a fair amount of information out there. People know that it's not a good idea to smoke when you're pregnant, or drink alcohol for that matter, and I've seen that a number of times in public. But nonetheless, it takes place. And in addition to that, there are a number of things that I think people need to take into account when we talk about responsible reproduction. What about cost? This is something that very, very few people take into account. In fact, it's almost a truism that people just try to wing it. They might not have the money, but they think, oh, we'll figure it out somehow anyway. Where does this come from? Where does this notion that either financially or health-wise people can just do what they want when they're either about to conceive children or post-conception? Well, I think it goes back to our deepest roots, the desire to reproduce, the desire to have children, to have offspring, to pass on your genes, sure. And from this we derive an almost intuitive sense that there's an inherent right for each and every individual to reproduce as much as he or she wills, and with no limitations or constraints. Now that might be the general sense and intuitive feeling that people have, but as we move forward in the future, we have to observe that the world and environment we live in have changed. It's not the same free-for-all it used to be, where you had to have 15 children just to make sure that 3 or 4 of them saw past 4 or 5 winters. It's not the case anymore. But we cling tenaciously to what I think is an archaic notion that even individuals who are not responsible should still reproduce, or should have the fundamental right. Obviously, this issue can be pretty thorny. People might be thinking I'm suggesting government intervention. Not necessarily, but here's an idea. If we think that after a child is born, it's a bad thing if parents are beating the child and causing possibly permanent damage to the child, then why is it not of equal footing if you're smoking as a woman and potentially at least causing permanent damage? Would a child who's beaten be guaranteed to have some permanent issue? Possibly not, but it's very likely in any event. And I think this is the issue at hand, that we have this notion that everyone and anyone can reproduce, heedless of the consequences. And I'm not even talking about eugenics here. I'm just talking about basic concepts of responsibility. Let's say you don't have the money projected down the line to have children. Well, the government will take care of that. You can just get on welfare, get government checks. Because children are expensive, aren't they? And most people, the people who have the fewest children, tend to be responsible about this. They wait a long time and they see whether or not they can afford these things. However, that is a rarity. In most cases, people just have children, as does this woman who works at the kiosk where I get my morning coffee at times. I'm sure she didn't give it much thought, and she's obviously not giving it much thought now as she continues to smoke. At the very least, I think there needs to be more open discussion and discourse about these things. That responsibility goes beyond what happens after you've conceived, but also prior to conception and just after conception when the child has not yet been delivered. Because if people are permitted to get away with this, the consequences are pretty dire, if you think about it. It's very likely a child born to a smoking mother will have some kind of health issues, possibly some long-term, if not permanent issues. That becomes a burden to the parents and the state. This is something that people ideally would like to avoid. But I think the real issue at hand is how we might get around people's deeply embedded and ingrained intuitions about the fundamental right to have children, even if they're not responsible, even if they're not acting in an appropriate way. Am I suggesting state intervention? Not necessarily, but I am suggesting we have more discussion. And I'm also suggesting that we offer more censure towards people in general, and women specifically, who engage in deleterious and harmful practices despite being pregnant, and maybe even some kind of educational program where people actually learn that there are consequences to having children. Again, once children are out in the world, there is state intervention. If parents are known to be abusive to their already born children, the state can intervene, and perhaps it should also intervene. It's generally acknowledged that in that case, parents have no right to access to their children because of their abusive practices. But isn't smoking and drinking copious amounts of alcohol when you're pregnant tantamount to abuse? And isn't endowing your children with a poverty-stricken lifestyle when you knew that would be the outcome, perhaps not abuse per se, but at the very least a very, very negative consequence to poor planning and lack of responsibility? Again, I don't see any of these things reinforced in the mainstream. I don't see any notion of a term reproductive responsibility out there. There are many, many reasons why I personally have no interest in reproduction, but a very obvious one is I simply don't have the financial means to support a child. Even if it were my deepest desire and I could think past all the genetic issues that might arise, as well as social issues, as well as my general antipathy towards children, it's a simple matter of fact that I make enough to get by for myself. Sure, I could take on an additional job, but I don't think I have the fundamental earning capacity to provide a good lifestyle for a child, to double my work output or triple my work output, simply because my skill set is not amenable to that. I wasted my time studying useless things like medieval history, among other things. So even not considering these other things I normally would adduce as reasons why I'm not interested in having children, it's a very, very real reason, not having sufficient funds to support a family. And the idea of just winging it, to me at least, seems hopelessly irresponsible when the money is just not there. And yet people do it all the time. So what can be done about this in actuality? I think having state-enforced mandates borders on the dictatorial and autocratic. That might be too risky. And the other option, the only option that remains, is more public discourse, more education about these things. Because frankly speaking, there is no other option. Unless you want to go full autocrat, full dictator, and say certain people just can't or shouldn't have children. And to some degree that's true. I think that certain people should not have children if they cannot be responsible either financially, genetically, or for reasons of the abuse of substances that they tend to use, particularly during pregnancy. That if we want to avoid the route of complete control over people's autonomy and reproductive autonomy, the only thing we can do is to be more stringent in our education and more censorious in how we approach people and how we talk to people and deal with people who engage in these very risky and irresponsible practices prior and after conception. I see no other way around it. But I think it's in everyone's interest to get the good word out, because do we honestly want another, frankly speaking, mentally retarded child as a result of drinking when you're pregnant or smoking when you're pregnant, or more people stuck in a hopeless cycle of poverty because people just didn't have the forethought to think ahead about the consequences of their sexual activities? Obviously, I have to concede that there's no easy solution here. A lot of the people who engage in these irresponsible practices are, well, frankly speaking, not that bright. And so responsibility of this sort is not a natural phenomenon to them. But nonetheless, I think we do need to take more proactive measures in this sense, because people, again, are very concerned with harm and suffering of children, and yet we don't think about it prior to that. Now, I'm not offering an antinatalist argument here, although I could, but let's just assume people are going to have children regardless. Let's try to facilitate it in the best way possible. If you're going to have a child and you cannot for the foreseeable future afford a child, maybe it's not a good idea to have the child, because ultimately in that case, the only thing you're doing is passing on your genes. You're following a biological imperative, but you're also condemning a sentient being thereafter to immense suffering, possibly, and a cycle of poverty he or she might not be able to get out of. And then it goes without saying, the case of substance abuse and being pregnant and what have you, that should be a clear-cut issue. In fact, I personally, and this is one case where I probably would push as far as state intervention, if you're smoking or drinking when you're pregnant, then it should be illegal. And as you should not be permitted to do that, and you should at the very least be fined. The reason I'm saying that is, unlike abortion, the woman, we would assume, who is smoking or drinking or taking drugs whilst pregnant, at least intends to carry the child to term. And she's inflicting, knowingly, harm upon the child, and the child will almost certainly suffer as a consequence of her irresponsibility. I think in this particular case, women who engage in substance abuse when they're pregnant should, at the very least, be fined and penalized for it, because this is not a good precedent. Anyway, that's my idea of responsible reproduction, taking into account financial matters, the very obvious matters of substance chemical abuse, and other things that I did not mention because that would border on quote-unquote eugenics. But I'm trying to offer a more mild line here in the sense that, okay, you're going to have children regardless. Let's approach this in a responsible way rather than just willy-nilly popping out children and damaging the children in the process, whether it's financially, chemically, or otherwise. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. If I'm still alive, there'll be more to come. Take care. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.